Whoa, we have a crazy good panel here, and I'm only regretful that we don't have a whole lot more time to answer the very easy question of how we will grow food for the future. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to just read you something to allow us to frame the discussion a little bit, and then I'm going to let these guys rip, and I will ask the most provocative possible questions I can of each of you so we can have a rousing discussion. But I encourage you to find them after this. As Lauren said, I'm the editor of The New Food Economy. If you don't know us, we're a nonprofit newsroom based here in New York. We cover the economics, politics, and culture of food. And you can find us at newfoodeconomy.org. And I have with me, starting at the end, Rachel Stroer, Chief Strategy Officer from the Land Institute, Jack Algiere, who's a farm director at Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture, followed by Marc Oshima, co-founder and CMO of AeroFarms. And to his left, no, to his right, Sean Lenihan from The Honest Bison, and Andrea Egan from the UN Development Program, and finishing with Tobias Peggs, who's the CEO of Square Roots. Okay. So two things happened last month. One of them is that the human population ticked over to 7.6 billion people. It's expected to grow to 9 or 10 billion by 2050, and if you Google those two things, 2050, 9 billion, you will see a barrage of alarming headlines about whether we're going to be able to feed all those people and how. So also last month, early in the month, the journal Nature published a report that was equally alarming. There's going to be a lot of alarm. But I want to start the conversation by framing it with this thought, and then I'm going to ask folks to talk about individual points of focus for the moment. So the authors of this study in the journal Nature wrote, "The food system is a major driver of climate change. Changes in land use, depletion of freshwater resources, and pollution of aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems through excessive nitrogen and phosphorus outputs. Between 2010 and 2050, as a result of expected changes in population and income levels, the environmental effects of the food system could increase by 50 to 90% in the absence of technological changes and mitigation measures, reaching levels, this is my favorite part, reaching levels that are beyond the planetary boundaries that define a safe operating space for humanity." So we're on a little bit of a roller coaster ride, and it's going kind of fast. So I'm going to start with Jack, because I think that Jack has some good thoughts on how we can start framing this discussion for ourselves to avoid overwhelm. And one of the things you mentioned is that we live kind of in a binary. We can either feed people or we're not going to be able to feed people. But you're suggesting we think about it in a slightly different way.
Well, yeah, I think if we're looking at the big problems of this world as being the environment, of the issues that we have there, and the disconnection from our food and the food system, then I would say that we really need to look at it not just about feeding people, but about building communities, getting people involved, because we need a lot more people involved in agriculture. And also looking at agriculture as a conservation act, is that we have a lot to do to care for this planet. And the more we learn, the more we realize that actually good agricultural practices in relation to conservation is one of the best ways to combat climate change. So that's the first thing. The other is just that more of us need to be engaged, to actually get in touch with the land again. Our choices are very relative to our knowledge. And if we don't know enough about where our food is coming from and really don't have an emotional relationship, and frankly can't enjoy it enough, how can we ask for it to be better? So I'm just going to encourage everybody that we need to be connected to it to make a good choice. I don't think that everybody needs to be a farmer, but everyone needs to understand that eating is a direct agricultural conservation act.
But you do have a farm-centered approach, but you also suggested that the folks who should be leading the discussion on how we're going to feed people, how the food system can be changed, are perhaps not policy people, lawmakers, but farmers. What happens when farmers become the major drivers of conversation about this?
Well, I think farmers are really important in this aspect because the farmers are the stewards, but everybody needs to be engaged in that. A farmer will not succeed in any community unless the rest of the community actually appreciates what that person is doing. That it's proved itself as the land value and emotional value of what agriculture is just gets continually pushed out and away, and just looked at solely for its economic value rather than its cultural value. So that's what really needs to return. It's not that the farmer is the one that's going to change it. It's that the farmer is the source and some of the last real stewards we have that we can connect to and encourage to bring back towards the urban centers.
And so while we're talking about growing, I'm going to move to Sean, who represents the animal agriculture portion of this farmer discussion. And I'm going to prompt you in two ways. So the first one is, you have said to me, it's not just that we need to grow more food for the next 20 some years as the population increases, but it matters what kind of growth. So we talked a little bit about that, and then I'm going to give you the more fun question. Okay.
So from our perspective and the customers that we serve, it's much more a quality equation where the health of the soil, the health of the animal, the nutritional density, the nutritional value to the consumer is paramount above quantity and price.
And we should say you're growing bison. I mean, that's your
Yep.
primary animal, but not just bison, right?
No, we just added elk and venison that are domestically raised. They're farmed, very much similar to the methods that bison are. And so the nutritional density of those meat proteins are on par with bison, which is significantly more than factory farmed, confined meat proteins. So we've added that. The customers love it, and it's not always readily available like the domesticated animals. So.
But now bison is a peculiar creature. So, you know, the way that the industrial food system is set up to feed as many people as we can, and our demand for cheap food sort of drives this. But bison is not a fast-growing animal, and it's not a, you know, grow a chicken in 40 days and get it on the shelf. How do you, well, first of all, for folks who don't know, bison's sort of growing. Yeah, so talk about that peculiarity,
right.
But also how we manage that if we want to eat creatures who have a longer growing cycle.
Sure. So this is you're touching upon a larger context on why. So to give you scale, 90 million cows in the United States, 120,000 are slaughtered every day. We eat a lot of beef. There's only 200,000 bison in the United States, 200,000 in Canada, 60,000 are slaughtered every year. So we're talking about an exceptionally high valued, low supply meat protein. It's also the slowest growing. So a female cow will have its first calf around 18 months. A female bison will take 3 years. So if I'm a cattle rancher, I can grow my herd twice as fast. So at the same time, that female cow will have maybe 10 years of productive calves. Bison regularly can have 20 plus years of calves. So they're super durable, they're hard to kill, and they're exceptionally nutritious. They're good for the land as well. So here we have something that's indigenous, whereas cows aren't, that works really well on our land. It nourishes us. It's durable, it's economical. And the only reason, back to your point, the only reason that we have a bison meat industry today is because some cattle ranchers took the commodity template of let's have some calves, let's feed them cheap feed, corn, grain, soy, and let's take it to market. So a grain-fed bison, which makes up 90 to 95% of all the bison that you can buy today, was through a feedlot that was fed corn, grain, and soy. You can get that animal up to market weight in 18 months. In 100% grass-fed, what we sell, and others, it's 24 months to 36 months. So you can see, would you like your animals to pay rent for 18 months or pay their rent for 3 years? So you can see where the market forces incentivized speed and lower cost. But the consequences are degraded environment, less nutritional health, animal welfare issues, and so those dominoes start to fall the wrong way.
And Rachel, you would have something to say about this as well, since we're talking about growing cycle, which is also a conversation about soil health. And let's talk about the difference. So we've got animal protein. Rachel at the Land Institute especially is thinking about what kind of grains we're growing, right? And that there's an alternative as well if we're thinking about long-term sustainability and feeding people. We can be thinking about crops differently and meaning going from annual to perennial, for instance. Let's have at it with that, and then I'm going to ask you about a particular one.
Okay, sure. So thank you. And at the Land Institute, and I personally believe that the future, regenerative future for food, and in particular grain, which makes up 70% of our global calories and takes up about 70% of our global croplands, is and should be rooted in two technologies. You could think of them as new, or you could think of them as ancient. We, as an organization, received them from one of the most brilliant innovators over the course of humanity. Her name is nature. Those two technologies are perenniality and diversity. And so what we're doing is trying to bring those two characteristics back into grain agriculture because it is absorbing the largest caloric and land area of our food system. And so that sort of introduces that idea.
And there's a particular grain that I want you to talk about. How many of you have heard of kernza? This morning. Did you eat kernza this morning? Okay.
No, they were talking about it.
Okay. So I want you to talk about kernza because if you are going to hear about a perennial grain right now, either on the tech side or the investment side or on the growing side, you're probably going to hear about kernza.
Sure. So I want to start with the temporal comment about developing perennial grain crops. So the Land Institute has been in existence for over 40 years, and we have been in earnest breeding perennial grain crops, including kernza, for more than 20. So we've been working on this for 20 years, and kernza is the first of the hopefully many future perennial grain crops that is entering into the marketplace. One of the first larger products is created by Patagonia Provisions. It's a beer called Long Root Ale. You can get it in California and Oregon and Washington. And then there are all kinds of local eateries using kernza in everything from sourdough to croissants to pancakes to tortilla chips. And my favorite is ice cream. In fact, there's a local baker here, Zachary Gulper, who's used it and has served it in his storefront, Bien Cuit, here in Brooklyn. So, yeah, kernza is the first out there. The timeline thing is that we've been working on it for 20 years. It's still not really ready for the prime time. It's not, the yield doesn't compete with the crops that it needs to replace on a farmer's field. So we can't expect a farmer to sacrifice and risk his or her livelihood to grow this thing that doesn't make a lot of sense and is expensive. So it's a niche. It makes sense really only in a niche. And the impact that it can have on sequestering carbon, on reducing water use, and holding nutrients and building soil organic matter, among other things, really happens at the scale of the 70% of agricultural lands that I mentioned earlier. And so getting to that will take decades. And right now, though, it's sort of giving us a ray of hope in this niche market and helping us go back to the limiting factor of this grain right now is ongoing development in genetic and agronomic advancement of the crop itself.
So now let's move inside. And we have two indoor farmers with us, but representing slightly different approaches and perspectives. So we'll start with Tobias from Square Roots. And I want you, if you would, first to talk about the role of urban spaces in this conversation, because we know that more people are moving to city centers than they are to rural America, which is a massive sea change over the last 50 years. So let's assume that crowded urban spaces are going to be something that we're contending with in this 2050 9 billion people equation. So where does indoor farming fall into that?
Well, what we're hearing about here a lot, education, advocacy, are all kind of part of that. That's the push, right? Telling the consumer there's a better way, right? And to change your eating habits. But we're also now seeing the pull, right? Which is the consumer's got that, and you're seeing huge changes in food buying patterns in this country as a result of that, right? People are rejecting the industrial food system en masse, and they are wanting, locally grown, sustainable food that they can trust, right? And we're seeing that with, organic food, for example, right? Has gone from literally nothing to become a $50 billion industry in this country in a decade. That is all driven by consumers saying, give me food that I can trust. And if you kind of break that down to its fundamental part, right? What people are really saying is, okay, I want food where I've got a connection with the person that's growing the food, right? Who is growing my food? Where does that come from? I want total transparency there. And so urban farming can play an enormous part of that, right? Mark, I'm sure we'll talk about, how the technology allows us to grow this food all year round with fewer resources, and that's all awesome. But what it can also do then is be this pivot point for the connection between the urban consumer and the farmer, right? Literally anyone can jump on a subway now. You live in New York, you can jump on a subway and come visit our farm and come hang out with the farmers and come see how this food is being grown and get that connection, right? So when I think about the impact of urban farming on this new food system that we all want to produce, it's really how urban farming can, act as that focal point for the connection between the consumer and the people that are growing their food.
So in a way, these urban farms become part of the existing infrastructure, which might involve some different approaches to city planning here, but that's another discussion. But what size spaces are we talking about?
Well, they can range, right? And so, our system, we use a modular system. So we build our farms actually inside of refurbished shipping containers. And actually that allows us to repurpose a whole bunch of existing city infrastructure, right? We can pop up a farm on a disused parking lot or an empty warehouse or somewhere like literally right in the same neighborhood as the people that are going to eat the food. And by using these modular systems, which are all cloud connected and supported by a technology platform, it means it's very, very scalable. So in aggregate, you can grow a ton of food and get those economies of scale. But you do that by having a very distributed network of micro farms, right? That are all just producing enough for that particular neighborhood.
So then, Mark, moving from the idea of the sort of more modular approach to urban farming that Square Roots has, AeroFarms, by contrast, is a significantly larger operation in terms of space. And what does that mean? Because you know AeroFarms, you probably know AeroFarms, and you're just outside Newark, am I right?
We're in Newark.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, what role does the city play in, talk about the size of your warehouse first, let's do that.
Well, and I can and I will, and I want to just kind of paint in the picture of, I think you have a lot of different viewpoints here, but what we share, and there's a lot more commonalities in terms of a vision about how do we create more of a connection with our food, right? An idea, what we can do, we need to think about different solutions and different approaches with that. And I think one of the ways that we're excited about our impact, both in terms of large-scale commercial farms, is really the idea that we can have an impact in cities in terms of creating jobs, creating connection with the food, opening up our doors. We're addressing a food desert in Newark, where we have our global headquarters. But one of the reasons why we're in Newark, our roots, we actually started out in the Finger Lakes area, upstate New York. We actually started selling into places like Ithaca Farmers Market, so very much rooted in traditional agriculture. Our chief science officer was a professor at Cornell University. It's one of the top ag schools, so very much in terms of thinking about science and ag and thinking about the impact we can have. But one of the reasons why Newark was so attractive is that we've actually had one of our working farms at Phillips Academy Charter School, and our partner here, Frank Manasana, is here. And it's actually, our technology is very modular. It can be adapted to different spaces. So the idea that we can actually have an impact on multiple levels. Our farm at the school is actually right in their dining hall, and it becomes another classroom, another connection with the food. And I think that ultimately, at the end of the day, is understanding where your food's coming from, what goes into that, and it's creating that connection with that food. So really championing this food literacy and familiarity. What we realize, though, in terms of the impact that AeroFarms wants to have is very much on a global basis, these macro issues we're talking about, access to fresh water, loss of arable land, Mother Nature, climate change, that we need to be having a bigger impact in terms of the size of the farm. So our biggest farm in Newark, it's one of 4 that we have there, is 70,000 square feet. It's the world's largest in terms of output, in terms of efficiency, growing up to over 2 million pounds of leafy greens a year. So this is really changing the equation and thinking about how do you enable local production at scale, how do you bring the farm, this idea of distributed. So today, most of our produce and product is coming from California or Arizona. As a company, we can grow a wide range of different crops. The reason why we focus specifically on leafy greens is because it's one of the most nutritionally dense, and so we really want to reframe, again, the idea a calorie is not a calorie, and how we have more of an impact in the community. And so the work we're trying to do is thinking about that scale. So whether it's a farm here in Newark, whether it's in Dubai, whether it's in London, we are leveraging technology. So we're growing in warehouses without sun or soil. We understand what the plants need. The Aero and AeroFarms refers to aeroponics. We're misting, so we're using 95% less water than the field and even 40% less than a hydroponic. And we're using things like LED lights to deliver the right spectrum of light that optimize for photosynthesis. And at the end, what we're trying to do is create a more flavorful, a more nutritious, and more importantly, a consistent product all year round. So those are the kind of things we're trying to think about with our resources and how we can have an impact.
And for both of you, really, since we're talking about working within an existing infrastructure framework, whether it's, a shipping container or, an empty warehouse, just since we're in a place that mostly grows up, or only grows up for the most part, how high can we go? How tall can we grow? And you knew I was going to ask you that.
Yeah, so just to get, there's lots of different definitions around vertical farming, and some people think of multi-use, skyscrapers and thinking about that. For us, we define vertical farming as how many beds of growing can we get stacked in a space. It's typically single level because it's about efficiency of workflow, and again, at the end of the day, is how do you have the right business model and the work operations. So for us, though, our farm is 38 feet high, just to give you a sense, and it's up to 12, 14 levels of growing in that space. So the idea that all of a sudden we're talking about productivity per cubic foot, not square foot, it's game-changing in terms of thinking about the impact. And so when we look at spaces like this, where we are today and how it's repurposed, each one of our farms has a different story, but this looks like it could be a farm for us, right? The facility that I mentioned that we're at is a former steel mill, right? One of our farms is at a former paintball entertainment laser tag center that had been formerly part of the Ballantine Brewery. So the idea that we can bring back manufacturing jobs, we can bring back and breathe new life into these buildings is another part of when we think about driving economic development and really having an impact in the community.
Using existing space. Do you concur? Or?
Yeah, and I love what Mark kind of flew past this thing about thinking about farming in cubic feet, right? We use a slightly different system. We grow on vertical walls, but the general idea is you can take a 2-dimensional field like you have in an outdoor farm and turn it on its end. And then you can rack that field back to back to back inside a box. And so now you're growing food in 3 dimensions instead of 2 dimensions. So you get a lot more food out of the same size footprint, right? And there were, panels earlier about GMO and CRISPR and all of this stuff. What I love about what we both do is we're growing GMO. Certainly, we're growing GMO-free. I'm assuming you are as well. Pesticide-free. It's the cleanest, most beautiful food you'll ever get. What we're able to do, though, is change the environment around that seed, right? And you get beautiful food, but just a ton of it from a very small footprint.
Okay, there's a reason why I saved Andrea for last. In part because this conversation is largely centered so far on food. But we need to talk about people. And so Andrea from UNDP, from the UN Development Program. So many of you probably know that the UN has laid out a set of sustainable development goals, the SDGs. And they are much more aggressive in terms of getting us out of the luxury of thinking that we don't really have to worry about this stuff until 2050 because the UN's cutoff for their goals is 2030. Am I right? Okay. So of 17 sustainable development goals, number 2 on that list is zero hunger, and it comes just after zero poverty. But I want you to talk a little bit, we can't have a discussion currently about changing the food system unless we acknowledge that there are entire populations of people that need this problem solved now, that aren't really about the hunger we're going to have. This conversation that I want to have with Andrea is about the hunger we have. So you've got a population of people in particular in the Central Pacific Ocean in Micronesia that would be a good probably frame of reference to enter into a discussion about need now.
Yeah. And just to step back just for a minute, so the branch of the UN that I work with, we have three main pillars. One is sustainable development, and the second is democratic governance and peace building, and then the third is climate and disaster resilience. And all three of those pillars have everything to do with how people eat and whether they can eat. And right now we have 821 million people who are undernourished. And we can all agree no one should be starving to death in 2018. So by 2030, the UN's very explicit goal with very specific targets is to have zero hunger. So in a place like Micronesia or Kiribati, where it's a tiny, tiny Pacific island atoll where it's just a ribbon of land in an ocean, in a giant ocean, and their exclusive economic zone, because they have all these scattered islands, 33 islands for this one tiny country, with their exclusive economic zone, they're bigger than Brazil. So it's a very small, scattered country where the highest point of elevation is less than a meter above sea level. So you can see how sea level rise is catastrophic. And so right now, they can't grow food. They are dealing pretty much entirely with imports. So they're getting rice, white flour, oil. So kids are eating donuts. They're eating Spam. They are experiencing sub-Saharan African levels of malnourishment, but then they're simultaneously obese. So these kids and their land mass or their country is supposed to be uninhabitable as soon as 2030. I would argue that maybe it's probably not entirely habitable right now because with saltwater inundation, they're not drinking clean water, they're not eating good food. But these kids don't have great options because they, if they are obese or if they have diabetes, as refugees or migrants, Australia and New Zealand won't accept them. The likeliest point where they will go is Papua New Guinea, which is probably not a great transition. So it's pretty hard to see.
So I'm going to ask you a not at all simple question, but since, we've got a range of thoughts on how to cope with existing food issues, but probably many of you are wondering, what can we do? So A, what can we do now as citizens of the world and as eaters? And how do we think about everything we've just talked about here, whether it's how we grow, whether it's what we grow, whether it's soil health, when the need is urgent, right? So is this about political will? Is this,
For somewhere like Yemen, I think political will really helps. So 14 million people right now, or it's 8 million and it's projected to go as high as 14 million really shortly, rely on emergency rations. So that's emergency rations distributed by Save the Children, by UN agencies, by the World Food Program. So looking at that, where 2 million children in Yemen right now are severely malnourished, that takes immediate triage. So for anyone that wants to support, there are a lot of organizations doing very good work. For the longer term, in a place like Yemen, building democratic governance and peace building is incredibly important. For all the countries in the Pacific that I work with, I'd like to bring all of you on my panel with me. They could really use some vertical shipping containers, growing nutritious food so that these kids aren't eating donuts all day, every day. But yeah, I think that we have the technological capacity, we have the innovation, we have the imagination to feed the planet. And most of the people in this room and most of the people here have the luxury of how, what do we want to eat? And we can caveat that, like, we want to eat local, we want to eat sustainable, we want to do all these things. We also really need to be motivated by helping people around us, people globally that, they don't have the luxury of choosing what they eat. They just want to be able to eat so that they don't die. So I would just say all of these technologies, how do we get these to developing countries where 1 in 4 kids right now are suffering from stunting, some form of stunting, and in a lot of countries it's as high as 1 in 3. Those children will forever have a diminished brain capacity because they're not getting enough calories now. So each one of these innovations and technologies, how do we take those to Kiribati or Uganda? How do we make sure that farmers are growing things with early warning systems so that they know if a landslide's coming, so they know when to plant? But yeah, I think the best things that we can do is transfer these technologies to other countries.
Okay, and I'm going to open the floor to questions, but I cannot do it without asking one other question about this variable of technology. So that there's another reason I saved that conversation for the end of this discussion. I want to throw a curveball in here, in part because it's top of mind, but also because often our response as a people and as an economy is to throw technology at problems that in many ways are systemic, are the responsibility of governments and NGOs. But I want to just talk about cell-cultured meat for a moment, because it is one of the many technologies that fall into the agri-food tech space that is offered up as a possible solution to reduce our reliance on land-based animal agriculture. I'm throwing it out to all of you because each of you work in a different part of the food system, and I'm just curious, briefly, tell me your thoughts on this. Is this a viable alternative? Can it be part of the same discussion that we're having about Kernza, for instance, or slow-growing bison?
Can I jump in to the ring?
You're gonna.
So I will say this. I do believe that we should have lab-grown meat to go to Mars. I don't know how else you get meat in space. So I think that's a good thing. However, when it's presented with the amount of resources, financial resources, that would go into creating such a product at scale, economically viable, it makes me cringe, because if the opportunity cost, basically, the opportunity cost of those resources going into the technologies that we could use on a nature-based system, so how tracking sensors with animals, with plants in a pasture to make the 3D printers that I own that are walking on 4 legs and are good to work at minus 60 degrees and 100 degrees, they exist. So if those resources were diverted to there, I think we would start to feed more people at an economic scale. So I caution chasing that technology, and what are we losing as an opportunity cost?
I'll share.
Okay, yeah.
If I can. I mean, I want to share one point, which is, I don't think it's an either or. I think it has to be multiple solutions at this table, and that will help drive innovation that then can be transferred into both field as well as into practice. Where we need help in terms of like, how do we think about embracing this? It's really around how you frame it. And so this, you called it cellular, he called it lab-based, right? So the Good Food Institute would say cultured meat.
Frankenmeat?
Well, Frankenmeat is also, but the point is, cultured meat, craft meat, the point is, the art of fermentation, right? This is celebrated, and this is exactly what it's doing, is, again, how we can potentially position something as well. And so it's around language and then thinking about, again, embracing multiple ways. It's not about polarizing, I think, is what is really ultimately needed here.
Did you have, Jack, Rachel?
I think we'll probably be kind of in line here. First off, the assumption there would be the reason why we would want to go down that road is because we need all that protein and because people shouldn't eat meat at all. But maybe I want to take it away from the food for a second and talk about how we manage our ecosystems and the function of animals in ecosystems and how we have distorted that for the sake of sort of unsustainable eating patterns, the amount of meat that we eat, and our relationship to how we design our plate and what is at the center of that plate, I think is a really important thing to consider. These animals have, we're managing this planet to a greater degree now. We have taken on that responsibility. And part of doing that is being responsible for the ecology of this place, including animals on grasslands, which is an absolutely essential aspect of maintaining grasslands. And whether or not we need to match the amount of grass-fed beef with the amount of CAFO beef that we're eating at this moment is neither here nor there. What we should be doing is managing our ecosystems to create our diets. And whether we have better ferments and shift our diets to reflect good ecosystems would probably go a long way, especially in a local economy.
You said it much better than I would, so I'm going to say something different. I would just say that I think we have to be careful about throwing technology around and not thinking deeply about the histories that brought us to where we are. It took 10,000 years for us to get to the agriculture that we have today that is destroying the ecosystems on which it depends and on which humanity depends. And it will be, to silver bullet our way out of that is inconceivable in my mind. And so I think we have to be really careful about not letting, and I think we had to broaden our view of what technology means. That was sort of what I was trying to frame earlier, that we have, nature has technologies and has a lot longer history of success with those technologies than we do today. So I think I'd rather go with the track record of her than maybe this, but maybe it's one of many. So yeah, I think we should just be wary. And I think the other danger of throwing, and that's kind of a dramatic term, but of throwing technology and silver bullets at this really complex, diverse problem that we're facing is that it allows us to not have responsibility for the day-to-day. Because we can say, oh, well, they're just going to make meat in a petri dish, so I don't have to worry about it anymore. So I can just continue with the life that I've been living and the consumption habits and the dietary habits and so on and so forth, and they've got that covered, right? And I think we have to be careful not to let our collective mind get distracted by what everybody in the room and everybody in the city and everybody on the globe it has to and increasingly will acutely have to respond to.
And we do have a powerful governing body, and that powerful governing body is the natural world. Do we have 3 minutes? What are we down to?
My mic's, oh, here it is. We have a couple minutes for questions.
Anybody have a question for this illustrious panel?
I see a hand.
Hi, so I volunteer for a non-profit organization, and we work with farmers who really struggle for money, and then we do large-scale water harvesting so that they can grow crops. So how can we transfer this technology to them who cannot invest, who don't have so much money to start hydroponics or indoor farming?
Yeah, I connect to that specifically at Square Root. So when we were putting Square Root together, we saw that problem, right? We saw the average age of a farmer in America is 58 years old, right? So there's all the problems with the industrial system that we know about, pollution, climate change, all these things. But one of the issues that doesn't really get the airtime is the demographic time bomb that's about to go off. Like, who the hell is going to grow the food? And the younger generations, are finding it hard to get started, right? To your point, it's really expensive. How do you do that? And so, yeah, one of the things that we did specifically at Square Roots was set up what we call the Next Gen Farmer Training Program, where we offer a 12-month program for people to come in. They work with us. They get paid. They get health care. They get benefits. These are things that, seem wild, right, to people who want to start farming. And over the course of the year, we hope that they become awesome urban farmers and then also are in a position to graduate from us and go off and become future leaders in the industry so that there are more of us working for this movement that we're all trying to get to, right? And all continuing or all also having those values to bring even more people in, and hopefully it'll be a domino effect.
Did you have something you wanted to say to that, Jack? Or
Well, the only thing I would add about in terms of a learning space is that farming and education and the fact that everybody can be involved in that is really important, that there are ways of training new farmers, whether that's indoor or on the ground, and that there's networks that can be created wherever you are. I mean, really, this is designed, especially on the ground agriculture, is really the kind of technology that's for that for all levels of economic development. And I think that's a really important thing to understand, that training and sharing ideas with each other is important. You could look around this room and really everyone in this room could start farming today and get involved, maybe just change the shoes, as long as we have access.
Yeah, I'd love you to say something about that, Andrea, also. Just how do we bring this technology to farming communities that aren't working in the American commodity system even?
So the UNDP has a small grants program. So if if these farmers that you're speaking of are in developing countries, there's a program that UNDP has called the Small Grants Program, which is celebrating its 25th year anniversary. They give out grants up to $50,000 to celebrate technologies, innovation, which includes, the full cohort of traditional knowledge and supports maintaining crop diversity. So that's a really great funding mechanism that goes directly from this program to community-based organizations, NGOs, farmers. So that's one resource.
Hey, I think Jack had great points on establishing synergies. I think that's one of the keys, especially if you're addressing systems like indoor farming, urban agriculture, and also the conventional agriculture, which is happening in the rural areas. So there's a huge disconnect in terms of how you merge these knowledge gaps between these platforms. So one of those things could be is establishing a seed bank. This has been done for the rural areas, but you could have seed banks that could be specific to indoor farming or urban farming. And I work in the urban ag space looking at soil health, and we are trying to work with groups here in the city of New York that are looking at composting practices in a clean soil bank. So that is something that's an application that can work across, where you're essentially establishing an artificial micro-ecosystem and trying to understand how the dynamics there. I mean, these can be shared across the platform, even for developing countries.
Did you say a clean soil bank?
Yep. So it's called the NYC Pure Soil Bank. I mean, basically, it's called the Pure Soil Initiative, and they have a clean soil bank.
So you're talking about preservation in some ways, right? So not just preserving your tradition, farming methods, but putting it in. We should talk. That's a good story.
That's good.
It's a good story for us. Thank you for that. Does anybody have something you want to add to that? Because it is interesting thinking about what role preservation, seed preservation in particular. Stone Barns has done some work in this, yeah?
Our focus is really around innovating around several different areas, but seeds and breeds is key to this, obviously for animals and vegetables. But that we've lost, the statistics you were throwing out about our food system and the age of farmers and everything, we've lost 95% of our plant biodiversity for vegetables and almost the same in animals. So, that's because of a very conventional choice of food and a system that we've created for ourselves. And there's a lot of loss around the world as indigenous seed banks get taken away. And that just know that this is really how it is. If you have a demand for more diversity and you're asking for this, the farmers can do that. This is a really important thing. The consumer is huge compared to the fraction of a percent of farmers in this country. We make the choices for how things are grown. And if we're not engaged in that and we don't ask for that diversity, it won't come to us. We can invent new seeds and we can breed and do all these things. We can save old seeds and we can have libraries. All of those are important, but unless you want them, they will not exist.
Mark, did you want to add something to that? When urban farming movement and seed preservation, are those connected?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of things I can share. One is addressing the point in terms of how to share information, right? And that's an important thing. And so AeroFarms, our focus is not about just urban farming. It's not just about indoor vertical farming. It's really about understanding plants better than anyone, how to grow them, and transferring that. So we actually have an initiative that we're doing with the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research. It's funded out of the Farm Bill. It's a $1 million program that we've matched. It's a $2 million initiative that we are looking at and how to identify the stressors of leafy greens to optimize for taste and nutrition. And this will be public research. We'll publish this in 3 years, and the idea is how to benefit the entire agriculture community. And at the end of that, what we're trying to do is how to drive those lessons We think about our growing process, in seed development. So this is the key thing here. Out in the field, it takes 7 years from a seed development in terms of that process. You have 1 May every year to get it right and understand. We're talking up to, for baby leafy greens, up to 30 harvests a year where we're optimizing and maximizing that learning. So it's accelerating that process that can benefit the broader universe. And so that's what we're excited about AeroFarms in terms of our expertise and capabilities to be able to extend that.
I'm deeply sorry that we're going to have to wrap it up, but I do want to say one final thing, which is that when the feeling of overwhelm starts to take hold, which many of us sort of live in perma overwhelm at the moment. But what's great about this particular panel is that each one of these folks represents a different focused concept that you can hang on to, rather than we're trying to figure out how to feed an unprecedented population in 20 years. Here are some ways to think about it. So I'm deeply grateful to all of you. It was a really fun conversation, and I hope that you will find them all elsewhere over some kind of a plant-based milk or something.
And go check out the tractor downstairs with Jack.